wouldn't believe what happened just 3 weeks ago, up in the northern Oregon mountains. A search and rescue helicopter crew captured footage of something that shouldn't even exist. The pilot hasn't slept well since that day, and the 2 hunters riding with him can hardly talk about it without their hands shaking. It all started on a Tuesday morning, when a 8-year-old hiker failed to return from what was supposed to be a simple overnight trip in the Cascades. His girlfriend had dropped him off at the trailhead Sunday afternoon, and he was supposed to call her Monday evening once he crossed to the road on the other side of the range. When Tuesday morning came and went with no word, she contacted the county sheriff's office. The missing hiker was no rookie. He was well equipped with proper gear, GPS, and emergency supplies. His planned route followed well-established trails through forest terrain the local rangers knew inside and out. Under normal conditions, someone with his level of experience should have had no problem finishing the hike on schedule. But the area where he vanished is notorious for its deep canyons and thick forest, where even seasoned outdoorsmen can lose their bearings. By Tuesday afternoon, the sheriff had assembled a ground search team, but the rugged terrain made covering ground on foot nearly impossible. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, broken up by steep ravines and rocky outcrops that could easily hide a person completely. After hours of searching with no trace of the hiker, the rescue team decided to call in helicopter support. The pilot had been flying search and rescue missions for over 15 years and thought he'd seen it all. He'd pulled injured climbers off cliffs, tracked down hunters lost in blizzards, and located hikers who had wandered miles off trail. But nothing in his experience could have prepared him for what he was about to see. 2 seasoned hunters had volunteered to join the search, both locals who knew the mountains better than most rangers. They'd grown up hunting and tracking in these woods, reading signs in the forest others wouldn't even notice. The pilot was glad to have them on board, since their knowledge of animal behavior and tracking skills often proved critical in finding missing people. The helicopter lifted off Tuesday afternoon, beginning a systematic sweep of the area where the hiker was last seen. Weather conditions were perfect, clear skies, good visibility, and only light winds. From about 1,000 feet up, the pilot could see for miles across the canopy, scanning for any sign of human activity or unnatural disturbance below. During the first hour, they covered the established trail system and surrounding areas. The pilot flew a tight grid pattern, making sure not to overlook any stretch of forest where someone could be stranded or hurt. The hunters scanned the ground with binoculars, searching for the bright colors of modern hiking gear that might stand out against the earth tones of the woods. They quickly spotted the hiker's campsite from the night before. It was set up in a small clearing by a stream, exactly where he had planned to stop. From above, everything looked normal. The tent was pitched correctly, his gear neatly arranged, and no signs of trouble were visible. But the hiker himself was gone. The pilot circled the camp several times while the hunters scanned the ground below. There were no signs of which direction the hiker might have gone when he broke camp that morning. The heavy tree cover made it impossible to spot footprints or tracks from the air, and the surrounding forest appeared untouched. Expanding outward from the campsite, they began widening their search pattern, focusing on places a lost hiker might drift toward water sources, clearings, or high ridges with good visibility. They checked ravines where someone could have fallen, open spaces where an injured man might try signaling for help, and rocky ledges overlooking the valley. 2 hours into the search, as they flew over a particularly remote stretch of forest, one of the hunters noticed movement below. At first glance, it looked like a large bear moving through the trees. Bears are common in the area, so that in itself wasn't unusual. But something about the way it moved caught the hunter's attention, and he asked the pilot to circle back for another look. On the second pass, this time flying lower, all 3 men on the helicopter saw something that made no sense. The figure moving through the forest wasn't a bear. It was walking upright, striding powerfully through dense brush on 2 legs. Even from hundreds of feet up, they could see how massive it was, easily 8 to 9 feet tall, with a broad, muscular frame covered in dark brown hair. But what sent a chill through every man on board wasn't just its size. It was what the creature was carrying. Slung over its right shoulder was something unmistakable, what looked like a human body. The form hung limp and motionless, dressed in what appeared to be hiking clothes, the backpack still strapped on. Even from that altitude, the hunters could make out the bright red jacket, perfectly matching the description of what the missing hiker had been wearing. The pilot's first instinct was to call the sighting in over the radio to the ground teams, but the hunters urged him to hold off and keep following the creature to see where it was heading. They needed to know if the hiker was still alive and what the thing carrying him intended to do. The creature moved with shocking speed across terrain a man could barely crawl through, heading toward a stretch of canyon cliffs on the far side of the forest. For the next 20 minutes, they shadowed it from above, watching as it pushed deeper into the wilderness. The pilot had to fly carefully close enough to keep it in view through the thick canopy, but far enough to avoid being noticed. More than once, they nearly lost sight of it as it slipped under heavy cover, but the hunters' tracking instincts helped them predict its likely path and reposition the aircraft ahead. Whatever it was, it clearly knew exactly where it was going. It followed what looked like a well-worn route through the trees, stepping confidently over streams, fallen logs, and dense thickets that would have stopped most people cold. The way it carried the body showed an almost frightening strength. It never slowed, never struggled, even while hauling the full weight of a grown man across brutal terrain. As they trailed it, the hunters began to notice unsettling details through their binoculars. The forest along its path showed signs of frequent use branches broken off at unusual heights, ground pressed down where no one should have been walking, and crude arrangements of sticks and stones that looked like primitive markers. This wasn't the first time the creature had traveled this way. Eventually, it reached the base of a sheer canyon wall. From above, they watched it disappear into a cave system carved deep into the rock. The entrance was partly hidden by thick vegetation, nearly invisible from the ground. But from the air, they could see that the opening was much larger than it first appeared, easily wide enough to swallow something that size. The pilot circled several times, studying the terrain. The cliffs were steep and jagged, with little vegetation except for a few hardy shrubs clinging to the cracks. No trails led to the cave, and it was the kind of place ground teams could never reach without technical climbing gear. Now the pilot faced a critical choice. By the book, he was supposed to radio in immediately and wait for instructions. But the hunters pressed their case hard. If the hiker was still alive, every second mattered. By the time a ground crew reached this remote canyon, it could already be too late. The debate inside the helicopter was tense, but short. The pilot had been trained to follow procedure and put safety first. Attempting a rescue involving an unidentified creature wasn't in any manual he'd ever read. But the hunters were adamant. They were experienced with dangerous wildlife. They were armed, and most of all, they might be the only chance the missing man had left. The hunters reminded him they had no idea what the creature planned to do. It might be preparing to kill and eat the hiker, or maybe it already had. Waiting for backup could mean the difference between life and death. They also argued that sending in a large ground team later could provoke the thing and put the hiker in even more danger. Finding a landing spot near the canyon proved nearly impossible. The terrain was rugged and overgrown, with almost no clearings large enough for a helicopter. Finally, the pilot spotted a small meadow about half a mile from where they'd seen the creature vanish into the cave. It was just wide enough for a safe landing, surrounded by tall trees that made the approach tricky, but it was the only option they had. As he began his descent, the pilot's hands trembled on the controls. In 15 years of search and rescue flying, he had never faced anything like this. Wild animals were unpredictable enough when cornered, but this wasn't just an animal. Its size and clear intelligence made it far more dangerous than any bear or mountain lion he had ever encountered. The landing was rough, but successful. The helicopter touched down in a cramped clearing, the rotor blades only about 20 feet from the surrounding tree line. The pilot immediately ran through his post-landing checklist, but his mind was elsewhere, haunted by what they were about to attempt. The hunters moved with the speed and precision of men who had spent decades in the wilderness. They gathered their rifles, ammunition, first aid kits, ropes, and radios. Their efficiency was unmistakable, but there was something different in their movements. An edge of tension that wasn't present on an ordinary hunt. They were preparing for something no one had ever faced before. As they geared up to leave the chopper, the pilot made it clear he planned to stay behind. Standard procedure required him to remain with the aircraft during any ground operations, and he wasn't trained to track dangerous wildlife through the forest. His job was to keep radio contact with base operations and be ready for immediate evacuation if necessary. But the hunters had other ideas. They argued they needed every ounce of help they could get for what was coming. This wasn't a normal search and rescue mission, and normal rules didn't apply. The creature they'd seen was larger and potentially more dangerous than anything they had ever encountered, and splitting up such a small group could be a fatal mistake. At first, the pilot resisted, pointing out that leaving the helicopter unattended violated multiple safety protocols. But the hunters pressed harder. They reminded him that the creature had already shown intelligence in how it moved through the forest and where it chose to hide. They might need every advantage they could get to outthink and outmaneuver it. More importantly, they warned, the hiker's time was running out. If he was already being kept as prey, every minute could mean the difference between life and death. The pilot's fear was obvious, but so was his sense of duty. After several tense minutes of argument, he made the decision that would haunt him for weeks afterward. He would join the hunters on the ground. He shut down the engine, removed the ignition key, and hid it in a place only he knew, ensuring the aircraft would be secure while they were gone. The half-mile trek from the landing site to the canyon wall took nearly an hour. The terrain was far tougher than it looked from the air. They pushed through dense thickets, splashed across rocky streams, and climbed over massive fallen trees blocking their path. The hunters led the way, using their tracking skills to cut the most efficient route through the wilderness. About halfway there, they found the creature's trail. The evidence was undeniable. Enormous footprints pressed into the soft earth, nearly 18 inches long, and sunk deep into the ground. The sheer depth of the impressions suggested weight far beyond any known animal in the region. The tracks were eerily human in shape, with distinct toe marks, but at a scale that defied any scientific record. Following the trail, they began noticing other disturbing signs of the creature's presence. Branches snapped at heights of 8 to 10 feet above the ground, far higher than any bear could reach. And these breaks didn't look accidental. It was as if the creature had deliberately snapped branches, marking territory or clearing its path. On several tree trunks, they found claw marks, long, deep gouges unlike anything the hunters had ever seen. They were too high and too powerful to have been made by any predator native to Oregon. Some of the scratches were fresh, still raw in the bark, while others were weathered with age, suggesting this thing had been using the area for a long time. Then came the smell. A heavy, musky odor hung in the air, saturating the forest around the trail. It wasn't the scent of any animal the hunters were familiar with. It was organic, yet alien, pungent and overwhelming, like a natural musk designed to mark territory or signal others of its kind. As they neared the canyon wall, the signs grew more unsettling. Primitive structures appeared along the path, crude arrangements of sticks and stacked stones. Too orderly to be random natural formations, yet far too primitive to have been built by people. Some seemed like markers, while others resembled shelters or storage caches. The most chilling discovery came just a few hundred feet from the cave entrance. In a small clearing, scattered bones littered the ground. Most appeared to be from deer and other forest animals, stripped clean and stacked neatly in small piles. Mixed in with the animal bones were objects that froze their blood, cold shredded scraps of clothing, a single hiking boot, and what looked like weathered human bones. The hunters exchanged grim looks as they studied the piles. This wasn't the first person the creature had taken. The evidence was clear. It had been hunting people in this area for some time, possibly for years. The missing hiker they were trying to save might already be dead, and they themselves could be walking into a trap. Still, they pressed on toward the cave, moving with greater caution now that they fully grasped the scope of what they were up against. This wasn't just a wild animal acting on instinct. It was an intelligent predator with a history of hunting and a track record of killing. The cave mouth loomed larger than it had from the helicopter, nearly 10 feet high and 15 feet wide, carved deep into the cliffside. Vegetation and strategically placed rocks helped conceal the entrance, making it nearly invisible from the ground. Only someone actively searching for it would ever find it. Fresh tracks led directly into the cave, massive footprints pressed so recently into the soil that some of the disturbed earth was still collapsing inward. Whatever the creature had done with the hiker, it had happened only hours ago. The stench rolling out of the cave was overpowering, a choking mix of musk, rot, and something unrecognizable. The hunters pulled cloth over their noses and mouths, but the reek was so strong it made their eyes water. Something had been living here for a very long time. Then came the sounds. Faint but undeniable shuffling movement, heavy footfalls, and something that almost resembled a guttural, primal call. The creature was inside, and it was active. The echoes bouncing off the rock walls made it impossible to judge how deep the tunnels ran. The pilot froze at the cave mouth, paralyzed with fear. Everything about this defied his training and common sense. But the hunters reminded him the missing man's life depended on them. A few minutes later, one of the hunters volunteered to scout ahead, while the others held their position near the entrance. He slipped inside with a small flashlight, its weak beam cutting into the darkness. The tunnel sloped downward and bent sharply to the right, vanishing into blackness beyond the reach of the light. When he returned just minutes later, his face was pale, twisted with fear and adrenaline. He had found proof of human presence deeper in discarded camping gear, torn clothing, and what looked like a makeshift holding cell, built from stacked stones blocking off a small side chamber. More importantly, he had heard a faint, ragged human voice calling for help from somewhere in the depths. The missing hiker was still alive, but barely. His cries were weak, desperate. There was no more time for planning or waiting. They had to act immediately. Then came the sound they had dreaded. The creature was moving closer to the cave entrance. It had sensed their presence. Heavy footfalls echoed through the tunnels, accompanied by its deep, labored breathing. Every second brought it nearer. They quickly sketched out a desperate plan. One group would create a diversion to draw the creature away from where the hiker was being held, while another would slip past and attempt the rescue. It was reckless. It meant splitting up their already small team, but it was the only way the hiker had a chance. The hunters positioned themselves on opposite sides of the entrance, using natural rock outcroppings as cover. The pilot, trembling but determined, agreed to help with the distraction. He hurled rocks against the canyon wall, creating sharp echoes meant to sound like multiple attackers. The effect was immediate and terrifying. From deep within the cave came a roar unlike anything they had ever heard, louder and deeper than a bear's bellow, yet laced with something disturbingly human rage, intelligence, raw fury. It was coming for them. Thunderous footsteps slammed through the cavern, growing louder with every heartbeat. Then, just beyond the beam of the flashlight, a massive shadow shifted in the darkness. The hunters could see it moving huge, deliberate, closing in. When the creature finally stepped into the mouth of the cave, all three men froze in horror. It was even larger than it had looked from the helicopter. Standing upright, it towered close to 9 feet tall, its shoulders nearly 4 feet across. Thick, dark brown hair covered its entire frame, except for its face, hands, and feet, where leathery dark skin showed through. Its arms hung unnaturally long, nearly reaching its knees even when it stood fully upright. But it was the face that terrified them most. It was not human yet. There was no mistaking the intelligence and awareness behind it. 2 pitch-black eyes studied them intently, not with animal rage, but with calculation. This thing wasn't just reacting, it was thinking, analyzing, and weighing the threat they posed. Instead of charging as they expected, the creature held its ground at the entrance, blocking their path while it studied their weapons and their stance. A low, rumbling sound rolled from its chest, strange and guttural, almost as if it were trying to speak. None of the men could understand it, but the tone carried more than simple aggression. What unsettled them most was the deliberate way it assessed the situation. Its eyes moved methodically from one hunter to the next, noting every twitch of muscle, every shift of a rifle. When one hunter adjusted his grip, the creature immediately locked onto the movement, its awareness razor sharp. This wasn't mindless animal behavior. It was evaluating, planning. Its stance was defensive, not reckless. Massive arms half raised, it formed a living barrier between them and the cave interior, yet it didn't advance, didn't lash out. Its breathing was steady, measured, not the frantic panting of panic, nor the snarl of blind fury. Every movement radiated intelligence and restraint. The standoff dragged on for minutes that felt like hours. The hunters kept their rifles trained, but hesitation crept in. It was undeniably a physical threat, but there was something in its manner that hinted at reason, something almost human. Then it made sounds, not random growls, but a complex series of clicks, rumbles, and tones, shifting in pitch and rhythm. At first, the hunters thought it was calling others of its kind, but slowly they realized these sounds were directed at them. The creature was trying to communicate, not in words, but in something far beyond mere animal noise. Then, a misstep, the pilot's boot struck a loose stone, sending it clattering loudly across the rocky ground. Instantly, the creature's head snapped toward the noise. But instead of reacting with rage, it tilted its head, curious. It made a softer sequence of clicks, then lifted one massive hand and gestured toward the fallen stone, as though asking what had caused the sound. From deep inside the cave came another noise, the faint, broken cry of the missing hiker, calling out for help. The effect on the creature was immediate. It spun back toward the sound, releasing a low, urgent series of calls. The tone wasn't hostile, it sounded almost protective. To the stunned men, it was less like a predator guarding prey, and more like a father trying to calm a frightened child. The creature looked back at the three men and gestured toward the cave, as if trying to explain something about the person inside. Its behavior defied every expectation. Instead of menace, there was something protective in its stance, almost as though it were guarding the injured hiker rather than preparing to harm him. When the hiker's faint voice began to weaken, the creature grew visibly anxious. It shifted its weight from one massive foot to the other, releasing soft, uneasy sounds that almost carried the tone of concern. One of the hunters decided to test it. Slowly, he lowered his rifle and took a cautious step back from the entrance. The creature reacted instantly, but not with violence. Its posture eased slightly, shoulders dropping as it let out a low, almost approving sound. When the hunter raised his weapon again, the thing tensed right back into a defensive stance. The pattern was unmistakable. It wasn't driven by blind aggression, it was responding to the threat level they presented. Terrified though he was, the pilot began noticing something else. The creature's vocalizations seemed to follow rules. Certain sounds were paired with gestures, with contexts. When it pointed toward the cave and uttered soft, quiet clicks, it felt almost like reassurance. When it answered the hiker's cries from inside, its higher-pitched clattering seemed directed toward him specifically, as if carrying on a form of communication. That realization shifted everything. The creature wasn't holding the hiker captive in the usual sense. It was protecting him. But from what? And why not let them help? Those questions would have to wait. The hiker's strength was fading fast. In a brief lull, while the creature turned to respond to the weak cries from deeper inside, one of the hunters seized the chance. Using the rocks and shadows as cover, he slipped along the edge of the cave mouth, moving with the silent precision of a man who had stalked prey for decades. The creature, focused on the others, didn't notice his flanking maneuver. He found a narrow secondary opening hidden between two slabs of stone, likely a vent or escape shaft the creature used. Squeezing through the gap, scraping against the rock, he gained access to the cave without alerting its sentinel at the main entrance. The rescue attempt was perilous. The hunter crept through a labyrinth of twisting passages, guided only by the faint, desperate cries of the hiker. He rationed his flashlight, flicking it on for seconds at a time to orient himself before plunging back into darkness. The tunnels sloped downward, damp walls polished smooth by centuries of water flow. The soft earth underfoot muffled his steps, but every sound seemed amplified in the silence. As he moved deeper, he began to realize just how elaborate the creature's domain truly was. These tunnels weren't natural in their current state. They'd been shaped, cleared, expanded. Loose rock had been carefully removed from passageways. Natural ledges had been arranged into crude storage shelves, where roots, berries, and other foodstuffs were neatly stacked and preserved. This wasn't the lair of a mindless beast. It was the dwelling of something that built, stored, and planned. The air inside the cave was surprisingly fresh, a sign of a sophisticated ventilation system drawing in oxygen through hidden cracks and surface openings. The temperature was steady and comfortable, making the cavern a perfect refuge from the harsh mountain climate. It was clear this creature had lived here for a very long time and had made deliberate improvements to adapt the cave for permanent habitation. Evidence of its intelligence was everywhere. Tool marks scarred the walls where passages had been widened and smoothed. Crude but effective drainage channels had been carved into the floor to keep living areas dry. Most astonishing of all, polished metallic surfaces likely scavenged or stolen from campers, were positioned to reflect and channel light deeper into the cave. The effect created a faint but functional illumination far beyond the entrance. Then came the discovery that changed everything. This creature was not alone. Signs of multiple inhabitants marked the chamber's smaller footprints, separate sleeping areas, and evidence of a social structure. Some tracks were tiny, suggesting juveniles. Others showed variations in size and stride that indicated several adults. This wasn't a lone monster, it was a family group. As the hunter moved past branching chambers, he glimpsed clear divisions of purpose. One area was set up as a food preparation site, with stone tools neatly arranged on a flat surface and evidence of controlled fire. Another chamber was lined with bedding made from gathered vegetation and animal hides. Most unsettling was a chamber devoted entirely to human possessions. Backpacks, clothing, camping gear, and personal items were arranged with deliberate care, sorted and preserved like a macabre museum collection. Some of the items were old and weathered, proof that they had been gathered over many years. Finally, he found the missing hiker. The man was in a small chamber, partially sealed with rocks and debris, but not as a prison. The barricade appeared designed to shield him from the deeper tunnels. Inside, the space resembled a makeshift infirmary more than a cell. A blanket of woven plants softened the floor, and a small underground stream provided clean water within reach. The hiker was conscious, but in rough shape. His leg was broken, his body covered in cuts and bruises, and dehydration had left him weak despite the nearby water. Yet it was clear someone had been tending to him. His wounds had been washed and crudely bound, food and berries placed within his reach. His story was stranger than anything the hunter had imagined. He explained in a hoarse voice that he had fallen into a ravine while trying to take photos. His leg was shattered in the fall, his phone destroyed, and he had resigned himself to either being rescued or dying alone. But instead of death, the creature had found him. It had carefully lifted him from the ravine and carried him here. For the past 2 days, it had brought him water and food roots, berries, whatever it could gather. Far from attacking him, it had kept him alive. The hiker insisted the creature meant no harm. It had prevented him from leaving, yes, but only to protect him. It tended his wounds, guarded him from predators, and kept him safe in its own way. The stone barricade was less a prison than a shelter, a place to heal. That revelation turned the rescue mission upside down. This wasn't a mindless predator. It was an intelligent being doing its best to help a wounded man in the only way it knew how. The bones they had found outside could just as easily have come from natural deaths or other predators, not evidence of murder. Still, the hunters knew they had no choice. The hiker needed real medical care. His family needed to know he was alive. They would have to remove him from the cave whether or not the creature allowed it. That decision made the escape the most dangerous part of the entire ordeal. The hiker couldn't walk, forcing the hunter to carry him on his back through the twisting tunnels. Every step risked alerting the creature to their movement, every scrape of boot against stone a potential trigger for disaster. Navigating back through the maze of passageways with the added weight was a nightmare. Corridors that had seemed manageable on the way in now felt impossibly narrow. Panic clawed at the hunter's throat with each turn, but he pressed forward, one agonizing step at a time, praying the creature wouldn't discover their escape. Several times, they were forced to stop as the injured hiker's pain became unbearable. Each pause risked discovery. The most terrifying moments came when they heard the creature moving through the main tunnels nearby, its massive footfalls echoing off the stone, sometimes close enough that they could hear its breathing in low, rumbling calls. During those encounters, they froze where they stood, hardly daring to breathe until the sounds faded again. At one point, in their desperation to avoid detection, the lead hunter missed a crucial turn and led them into an unfamiliar section of the labyrinth, deepening the nightmare. As the hiker grew weaker and their situation more desperate, they had no choice but to use the flashlight more often to stay on course. That was when disaster struck. The hunter's boot nudged a loose rock, part of a crude alarm system the creature had set. The stones clattered and rolled loudly through the chamber, the sound ricocheting like a gunshot through the cavern. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. From deeper in the tunnels came a roar of pure fury, not the strange communicative calls from before, but a sound of rage and betrayal. The creature's pounding footsteps shook the ground, dust falling from the ceiling as it advanced through the system, hunting for the intruders. At the entrance, the two men left behind could hear the commotion inside. They knew the rescue had been exposed. The creature was no longer focused on them at the mouth of the cave. It was storming inward, seeking the source of the disturbance. In that split second, they faced an impossible choice: charge in to help their companion or hold the line at the entrance. Against his instincts, the pilot volunteered to make more noise, shouting and hurling rocks against the canyon wall to create a distraction, buying precious seconds. But the creature was no longer attempting communication. Its calls had shifted to guttural bellows of rage, echoing with intelligence and fury combined. It was methodically sweeping the tunnels, closing the distance with every minute. Inside, the hunter carrying the injured man pushed onward, each step torture. The escape took nearly half an hour, every minute dragging like an eternity. They had to pause often to let the hiker recover, or to duck into side chambers whenever the monster's pursuit drew too close. The wounded man, though racked with pain, showed remarkable composure, biting back cries, knowing even the smallest sound could betray them. The most harrowing moment came as they neared the narrow auxiliary passage. A faint glow of daylight filtered in ahead, salvation within reach. But behind them, the creature closed in. Its breathing was heavy and furious, its presence so near they could feel the vibrations of its footsteps through the stone. Pressed flat against the cavern wall in a narrow cleft, they held their breath as the shadow of the beast passed within feet of their hiding place. It stopped, inhaling deeply, testing the air for their scent. Its breath was controlled but powerful, and the hunter could hear it clicking softly, probing the passageway they had just slipped through. For endless minutes, they braced themselves for discovery and a final, bloody confrontation in the cramped dark. But then, miraculously, the creature moved on, seemingly satisfied the corridor was empty. They waited a few agonizing moments longer before creeping forward again, every step deliberate, silent. At last, they reached the cave's edge. The other hunters rushed to meet them, helping ease the wounded man into the open. Behind them, the cave still rumbled faintly with the sounds of the creature searching, somewhere in the depths. They didn't look back. Together, straining under the man's weight, they carried him as quickly as the terrain allowed toward the waiting helicopter, every movement haunted by the fear that the monstrous guardian might reappear at any moment. They hadn't made it more than 100 yards before the sound reached them. The creature had discovered their deception. It was coming after them, crashing through the undergrowth with a roar that carried fury, betrayal, and heartbreak. This was no mindless chase. The way it pursued them was terrifyingly strategic. Rather than simply following their trail, it flanked them, moving through parallel routes in the forest, cutting across the terrain with uncanny precision. Several times they caught glimpses of its massive silhouette gliding between trees, impossibly fast for something so large. Despite its bulk, it moved like a shadow, silent when it wanted to be, always maneuvering to intercept. Its cries echoed across the forest, some raw and furious, others almost mournful. The same strange clicks and guttural tones they'd heard before were now laced with betrayal, like it was both enraged and grieving at once. The half-mile run back to the helicopter felt endless. Carrying the wounded hiker across rough terrain while being hunted pushed them past the breaking point. The pilot, though terrified, proved invaluable, guiding them around obstacles with his memory of the landscape from above, urging them on when exhaustion nearly broke them. But the creature was gaining. Every minute it closed the distance, and yet it never struck. Instead, it seemed to be herding them, driving them toward the meadow where the helicopter waited, as if its intent was not to kill, but to see them gone from its territory. The final sprint across the clearing was a blur of fear and desperation. As they reached the helicopter, the beast burst from the tree line behind them, bellowing with rage and sorrow combined. And then it stopped. At the edge of the meadow, it stood tall in the daylight, revealed in full for the first time. Its enormous frame was balanced, powerful, every line of muscle visible beneath its shaggy coat. But it was the face that burned into their memories. It wasn't just anger, it was sorrow, loss, the raw expression of something that understood exactly what was happening and why. The creature made no move to attack. It didn't lunge for the helicopter or try to reclaim the man they carried. Instead, it stood watching, its cries now mournful, almost like a farewell. The sound was unmistakable grief. The pilot's hands shook as he scrambled into the cockpit. He had never started the helicopter so fast in his life. The rotors roared to life, and within minutes they were airborne. Below, the figure remained in the meadow, staring up at them not with hatred, but with resignation. For the next 40 minutes, as they flew toward the nearest hospital, no one spoke. The injured hiker remained conscious, repeating again and again that the creature had saved him, that it had carried him from the ravine, fed him, tended his wounds, and kept him alive when death was certain. Doctors later confirmed his story in part. His leg was badly broken, his body battered, but the wounds had been cleaned and crudely bound in ways that had slowed infection. He was malnourished, dehydrated, but alive thanks, he insisted, not to luck, but to the very being they had all feared. The hiker's broken leg required surgery and weeks of recovery, but doctors confirmed he would heal completely. More telling, his vitals showed he had been adequately hydrated and nourished throughout his ordeal, supporting his claim that the creature had cared for him. The official search and rescue report noted only that the missing hiker had been located and airlifted to safety. It offered no details about the extraordinary circumstances of the rescue. The three men had agreed to keep the truth to themselves, partly to protect the creature from hunters or scientists, and partly because they knew no one would ever believe them. Still, the pilot couldn't let it go. The intelligence and compassion he had seen in that creature's eyes haunted him. It had saved a man's life, tended to his wounds, kept him fed and safe, and in the end had allowed him to be taken without a fight. In the weeks that followed, the pilot returned to the area, often during routine flights, searching for any sign of the being. He never saw it again. What he did notice, however, was that the cave entrance had been sealed, blocked by rock and debris, as if abandoned after their intrusion. The two hunters also returned several times but found no trace. The bone piles had been scattered, the trails erased. It was as though the creature and its family had vanished entirely. The hiker made a full recovery within 6 months and eventually returned to the trails, though never again to the remote canyons where the encounter had taken place. On rare occasions, he spoke of his experience to close friends, always emphasizing the gentleness and intelligence of the being that had saved him. The three rescuers remained bound by their secret. They met often in the years that followed, debating the meaning of what they had seen, struggling to reconcile it with everything they knew of the natural world. None of their previous wilderness experience had prepared them for this. The pilot eventually retired, citing the physical and mental toll of his work. But those who knew him suspected the real reason was deeper, that he feared someday facing something like that again, and doubted he would have the strength to endure it. The hunters continued their lives in the forests, but avoided the canyon where it had all happened. Sometimes they heard rumors from hikers of strange sounds or unusual signs in the wilderness, but no evidence ever surfaced. The encounter left them with questions none could answer. Was the creature unique, or part of a hidden population? Had it learned compassion for humans through past encounters, or was empathy simply part of its nature? Most haunting of all, had they done the right thing in taking the hiker away from a being that had risked itself to keep him alive? The hiker was grateful to be reunited with his family, but he too often wondered about the fate of the creature that had saved him. He hoped it had found a new home, safe from human interference, where its intelligence and kindness would not be treated as a threat. The pilot still kept the original footage from that first aerial sighting. It was clear enough to prove what they had seen, but too dangerous to ever release. To share it would invite the very consequences they had sworn to prevent. Years later, the memory remained vivid for all three men. They had seen something that defied explanation, something that challenged their understanding of intelligence, compassion, and the fragile line between human and wild. And though they had left the canyon behind, the haunting presence of that creature never left them. The forest where it all happened remains wild and largely unexplored. Hikers and hunters still venture into its remote corners, most without incident. Yet every so often, someone reports strange sounds or unsettling signs, reminders that they may not be alone out there. Whether the creature they encountered was one of a kind or part of a hidden population is still unknown. But for the three men who witnessed its intelligence and compassion firsthand, the experience proved one thing: the natural world still holds mysteries beyond what science can explain. The rescued hiker has never forgotten the being that saved his life. Despite the fear and confusion of his captivity, he remains convinced he encountered not a monster, but an extraordinary, intelligent creature capable of unexpected kindness. His story stands as a reminder that not everything terrifying is truly dangerous, and that sometimes our most frightening encounters can reveal the deepest truths about the world around us. For more remarkable stories like this, click here. I still wake up drenched in cold sweat when I think about what happened in those woods. What we did out there changed everything. And I can't shake the feeling that we brought something on ourselves we were never meant to mess with. It happened 3 years ago. I'm only telling this story now because the nightmares just won't stop. Maybe putting it into words will finally let me sleep again. Back then, I wasn't much of a hunter. I'd only been out 4 or 5 times total. Those trips were pretty tame: deer, ducks, the usual stuff you'd expect during hunting season. Nothing crazy. But I had 3 friends who were obsessed with hunting. They'd been at it since they were kids, knew every trick in the book, and were always pushing me to take on bigger challenges. That October, they called me up with a plan. They said it was time I learned what hunting was really about. I figured they meant moose, or maybe a bear, something that would actually test my skills. I agreed, mostly because I wanted to spend time with them, and honestly, I was getting bored of small game. The trip started before sunrise on a Thursday. We loaded the truck with enough supplies for a week in the wilderness: rifles, ammo, camping gear, and enough food to feed an army. The guys were acting strange from the start, cracking inside jokes I didn't get, and giving each other looks when they thought I wasn't paying attention. We drove north for 3 hours on the highway, then turned onto old logging roads that got rougher and rougher. Gravel turned to dirt, dirt turned into a mess of potholes. My buddy driving had to kick it into 4-wheel drive just to make it through spots where the rain had washed out half the road. After another 2 hours of bouncing around like ping pong balls, we pulled up to a rusted gate with a sign that read, "Private logging company property, no trespassing." One of the guys hopped out with a key and unlocked it. When I asked how he got it, he just grinned and said, "My cousin works for the company." We drove through, and he locked the gate behind us. From there, the road got even worse: deep ruts from heavy machinery, broken branches everywhere, and places where the bridge was long gone, forcing us to drive straight through the creek. We passed abandoned logging camps, rusting equipment, rotting away in small clearings, and mile after mile of forest that looked like no human had been there in decades. Finally, after what felt like forever, the road just ended. There was nothing but a tiny turnaround spot by a stream and wilderness in every direction. We'd been driving for 6 hours, and the hike was still ahead of us. We threw our packs on and started walking. The trail was barely visible, more like a game path than anything people had built. It twisted uphill through old-growth forest, trees so massive 3 of us together couldn't have wrapped our arms around them. The canopy was so thick that even in the middle of the day, it felt like we were walking in twilight. The guys kept checking their GPS, and a hand-drawn map one of them had brought. It was obvious they'd been here before, or at least studied the area carefully. Every so often, one of them would point out a landmark, a weird rock formation, a dead tree with a strange shape, a small meadow where deer had clearly been grazing. As we climbed higher, the forest changed. The trees grew even larger, looking older than anything I'd ever seen, maybe centuries old. The undergrowth was thicker too, ferns up to my waist and brush so dense you could barely see a few feet in any direction. We crossed 3 different streams on fallen logs, scrambled over rock slides, and pushed through thickets so tight we had to walk single file. My pack felt heavier with every step, and I started wondering if this was really worth it. But the guys never hesitated, never second-guessed where they were going. After 3 solid hours of steady uphill hiking, we finally came to a small clearing surrounded by giant cedars. It was obvious people had camped there before. There was a ring of stones set up for a fire, a few logs laid out as benches, and a patch of level ground where tents had clearly been pitched before. While we were setting up camp, one of the guys started talking about the place. He said, "We're in a forest most people have never laid eyes on, miles from any official trail or road. The logging company owns huge swaths of land out here, but they haven't cut trees in this particular area for more than 20 years. It's too remote, too tough to get equipment in and lumber out. That's when they finally told me what we were really doing out there. That first night, sitting around the fire, eating canned food and passing around a bottle of whiskey, the guy who had planned the trip began telling stories. He said this area had a reputation among hunters and loggers. Not the kind of reputation people talked about openly, but the kind whispered about in bars after too many drinks. He'd been researching the place for months, digging through old newspaper clippings and hunting forums, talking with retired loggers who had worked these mountains decades ago. All the stories shared certain details. A massive creature that walked upright like a man, but far bigger than any man had a right to be. Covered in dark hair, immensely strong and smart enough to stay out of sight. The first reported sighting in this area went back to the 1,940 seconds, when a logging crew found footprints the size of dinner plates pressed deep into the mud near their camp. Over the years, there had been dozens of encounters. Hunters had woken up to find their camps destroyed overnight by something with incredible strength. Loggers had heard calls in the woods unlike any known animal. Hikers had caught glimpses of something shadowing them from the trees. But the stories that really grabbed his attention came from the locals, small, isolated communities on the edge of the forest, the kind most people don't even know exist. These weren't tourists or weekend thrill seekers. These were families who had lived off the land for generations, people who knew the difference between a bear and something else. They spoke of a creature sometimes seen at the tree line, standing motionless, watching their homes. Kids weren't allowed outside after dark. Pets that wandered too far sometimes never came back. And every few years, hunters would vanish deep in the woods, leaving behind campsites that looked like they'd been hit by a tornado. The most detailed account came from an old hunter who had a face-to-face encounter back in the 1,980 seconds. He was checking his trap lines when he realized something had deliberately destroyed every single trap. Following the trail of wreckage, he came into a small clearing where he found signs of something enormous living there. Crude shelters woven from branches, piles of collected vegetation, even what looked like tools made of stone and wood. But what struck him the most was the smell. He described it as a mix of wet animal fur and rot, so strong it made his eyes water. While he was examining one of the branch structures, he heard movement behind him. When he turned, it was there 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, its face almost human, but not quite. They locked eyes for what felt like hours, though it could only have been seconds. Then the creature let out a sound, part roar, part scream, and part something else entirely. In an instant, it turned and vanished into the forest so fast he questioned whether he had imagined the whole thing. But he hadn't imagined the tracks it left behind. 18 inches long, pressed deep enough to suggest something weighing well over 400 pounds. As my buddy told these stories, I could see the excitement in his eyes. He even pulled out photos of footprints, copies of old articles, and a recording someone had made of the strange calls echoing through the woods. He was completely convinced that this area was home to at least one of these creatures, and he had planned our entire trip around the chance of an encounter. The other 2 guys seemed more along for the ride, treating it like an adventure rather than a serious hunt. It was supposed to be just an expedition, but I could tell they were taking it more seriously than they let on. They had packed extra ammunition, high-powered rifles with scopes, and camping gear chosen less for comfort than for keeping us alive out there in the wilderness. That first night, lying in my sleeping bag and listening to the forest, I noticed every sound in a way I never had before. A branch snapping might have been a deer picking its way through the brush, or it might have been something else. Leaves rustling could have been the wind or something moving just beyond sight. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, we split up to cover more ground. The plan was to look for signs of deer activity while keeping within radio range and to stay alert for anything unusual. We spread out in a line, each of us within earshot on the walkie-talkies, moving through a valley that seemed rich with wildlife. I'd hunted this way before, so the basics were familiar. Move slow and quiet, pause every few steps to listen and scan, look for tracks, droppings, feeding signs, or bedding spots. Always keep the wind in your face so your scent doesn't give you away. But almost immediately, something about this forest felt wrong. It was too quiet. Even in deep wilderness, you usually hear birdsong, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing. Out here, there were long stretches where the only sound was our boots crunching through dead leaves, and when we did hear something, it felt off. Bird calls that cut off mid-note, as if startled into silence. The crash of something heavy moving through brush, yet when we checked, nothing was there. And beneath it all was that constant feeling. We were being watched. I was following what looked like deer tracks along a stream bed when I found the first strange prints. They were sunk deep into the soft earth by the water, and they definitely didn't belong to any animal I knew. Too big for a human, the shape all wrong for a bear. Clear toes, even a heel. 5 distinct impressions, but massive, far larger than they should have been. I called the others over the radio. We spent 20 minutes examining the tracks and taking pictures. They were fresh, maybe a day or two old. The depth suggested something incredibly heavy, and the stride length was longer than any human could make. One of the guys got visibly excited, saying this proved the creature was still active in the area, but I felt a knot tightening in my gut. If something that big was moving around out here, maybe we should be a lot more careful about how we approach this whole situation. We followed the prints for nearly a mile, climbing out of the ravine to a ridge that gave us a sweeping view of the forest. Whatever it was, it had been moving with purpose. The trail didn't wander like an animal searching for food. It took efficient routes, used natural pathways, and avoided leaving obvious signs of its passage. At one point, the tracks led us to a tree that had clearly been used as a scratching post. Bark was shredded from 4 feet up to nearly 8 feet high. Deep gouges cut into the wood marks left by something with tremendous strength and claws sharp enough to tear wood like paper. But the most unsettling discovery came when we reached a small clearing near the ridge top. Something or someone had used that spot recently. There were remnants of crude shelters built from branches and strips of bark. Piles of pine cones and berries that looked like they'd been gathered and sorted, and scattered across the clearing were bones from all kinds of animals. Deer, rabbits, squirrels, even what looked like the remains of a bear. But every single bone had been split the same way. Marrow extracted, then stacked neatly into separate piles by size and type. The stench in that clearing was overwhelming. The same mix of wet fur and decay that the old hunter had described, but far stronger. It clung to our clothes, filled our noses and throats, made it hard to breathe. We didn't linger, but as we turned to leave, one of the guys spotted something that stopped us cold. Fresh footprints, leading away from the clearing and deeper into the forest. Only these tracks were different from the ones we'd been following. Smaller, but still much larger than a human's. And there were 2 sets of them, side by side. We weren't dealing with just one creature. There were at least 2 out there, and they were moving together. We spent the rest of that day, and most of the next, tracking them through forest that grew thicker and darker with every mile. The terrain grew rougher, the brush thicker, and the feeling of being watched stronger. More than once we heard sounds that could have been the creatures communicating low, resonant calls that echoed through the trees, too deliberate and patterned to be random animal noise. By the 3rd day, everything changed. We were following a game trail along a slope when the forest went completely silent. Not just quiet, dead silent. The kind of silence that makes the hair on your neck stand up. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Even our footsteps seemed muffled. That's when we smelled it again. That horrible mix of wet fur and rotting meat, stronger than ever, so thick it seemed to close in around us. We froze, signaling to each other with hand gestures. One of the guys pointed up the hill, convinced the stench was coming from that direction. Another tapped his ear, then pointed toward the tree line, indicating he could hear something moving. We spread out slightly and crept up the slope, rifles ready, trying to make as little noise as possible. With each step, the smell grew stronger, and beneath it, I started to pick up other scents, musk, animal odors, and something else that reminded me of a zoo or a pet store. The trail led us to another small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that blocked most of the daylight. The forest floor was thick with needles, muffling our footsteps. And there, standing in the center of the clearing with its back to us, was the creature we had been tracking. It was even bigger than I'd imagined. At least 8 feet tall, maybe 9. Its shoulders were wider than any man's, covered head to toe in dark brown hair, thick and coarse like a bear's but longer. It was busy doing something with its hands, arranging objects on the ground, completely unaware of us. We dropped to the dirt behind a fallen log and watched. The creature's movements were purposeful. It picked objects from a pile, examined them carefully, then sorted them into neat groups. From where we were, it looked like stones or pieces of wood, but whatever it was doing, it wasn't random. And that was the most disturbing part, how human its behavior seemed, the way it paused to consider its work, the precise, deliberate movements, even the absent-minded way it scratched itself or shifted its stance. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was intelligence, problem-solving, awareness. We watched for nearly 10 minutes, none of us daring to move or breathe too loudly. Every so often it made low grunts, tones that sounded like satisfaction, or maybe frustration. At one point, it rose to its full height and stretched, giving us a clear look at the sheer size and power in its frame. That's when the guy who had organized the trip made his choice. I saw him slowly raise his rifle, scope to his eye. The rest of us frantically signaled for him to stop, but he ignored us. He had that look hunters get when they see the trophy of a lifetime. Nothing else existed but the target. The creature stood about 60 yards away, angled slightly, with no idea of the danger. For an experienced hunter with that rifle, it was an easy shot. I barely heard him whisper over the pounding in my ears, "We're going to be famous." The rifle cracked like thunder in the stillness. The bullet slammed into the creature's midsection, spinning it around and driving it back a few steps. Black blood sprayed across the pine needles as it let out a roar so powerful it seemed to shake the trees. But it didn't fall. Instead, it turned on us faster than anything that size should have been able to move. Its eyes locked on our hiding spot with an intelligence that froze me cold. Wounded, furious, in pain but unstoppable. Then it charged. I've seen bears charge before. They're fast, but their bulk slows them down. This was different. This thing moved like a predator built for speed. It tore across that 60-yard gap as if the underbrush wasn't even there. We all opened fire. Instinct took over survival, drowned out everything else. The forest erupted with gunfire, the air filled with the stench of gunpowder and blood. I saw bullets hitting home, black patches spreading across its fur, but it just kept coming. We stumbled backward as we fired, trying desperately to keep distance, but its massive strides ate up the ground faster than our panicked retreat. I could see the fury in its eyes, the rage of a creature that had lived in peace until we invaded its territory and tried to kill it. My rifle held 5 rounds. I emptied them as fast as I could reload. At least 2 shots landed solid, but they barely staggered it. The others were having the same experience, hit after hit, but the beast absorbed them like it was built to withstand punishment. It closed to within 20 yards before it finally began to slow. Blood poured from multiple wounds, its breathing ragged, its movements jerky. But it still came on, still determined to reach us, to make us pay. It took 3 more direct hits before it finally crashed forward, skidding across the pine needles and slamming against a tree. Even then, it tried to rise. Its chest heaved violently, its eyes still fixed on us as if willing itself to stand again. We stood frozen, rifles still leveled, too terrified to believe it was over. The forest fell silent once more, as though every living thing was waiting to see what came next. When we finally worked up the courage to approach, the reality of what we'd done hit me hard. Up close, the creature was even more terrifying. Its sheer size was beyond anything I'd imagined. Its hands were twice the size of mine, black nails thick and curved like claws. Muscles bulged beneath the matted hair, power enough to tear any of us apart without effort. But it was the face that haunted me most. Not fully human, but not fully animal either. Heavy, primitive features, pronounced brow ridges, powerful jaws lined with crushing teeth. Yet something in the bone structure, in the way the features aligned, struck me with an awful familiarity, like looking into a distorted mirror. The eyes were the worst. Even in death, they held an intelligence that unsettled me to my core. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was a thinking, reasoning being that had lived its life in peace until we came along and killed it. The stench from the body was overwhelming. The same nauseating blend of wet fur and decay we had tracked for days, now mixed with the metallic tang of fresh blood. I had to back away several times to keep from vomiting. We had pumped at least 15 rounds into it from 4 rifles. The wounds were catastrophic, the blood soaking into the pine needles around it. And yet, it had taken all of that to bring it down. The body had barely steadied. Whatever this thing was, it was unbelievably tough and relentless. A smaller animal would have gone down after the first few shots, but this one kept coming almost to the very end. The guy who started this whole nightmare pulled out his phone, buzzing about documentation and proof. He wanted photos, measurements, maybe even to drag the body into a better spot for pictures. The whole idea felt wrong to me, disrespectful and grotesque. We had just killed something that might have been the last of its kind, and he wanted to treat it like a trophy buck. Before we could argue, we heard something that froze our blood. From somewhere deeper in the forest came a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It began as a low moan, almost subsonic, more felt than heard, then swelled into a wall of pure grief and rage. An emotion I couldn't name, but it struck me at a primal level. It was the sound of mourning of something that had just discovered what we'd done to its companion. The call seemed to go on forever, rolling off the ridges and echoing through the trees. When it finally faded, it was replaced by something worse, the sound of something enormous moving toward us without the slightest attempt at stealth, heavy footsteps closing in, limbs cracking and crashing aside. And beneath it all, a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. We could hear it from a quarter-mile out, and it made no effort to mask its approach. Trees shoved aside with casual force, footfalls so heavy they made the earth tremble under our boots. One of the guys began jamming rounds into his rifle, hands shaking so badly he could barely load the magazine. The rest of us followed suit, but the same realization was dawning on all of us. We had barely managed to bring down the first creature with surprise and overwhelming firepower. Now something was coming that knew exactly where we were, and it wanted payback. Through the trees, we caught flashes of movement, something even bigger than the one we just killed, moving with purpose and fury. Sometimes we'd glimpse a massive shape between the trunks or a flicker of dark fur in the shadows. Then the smell hit us, the same wet fur and rot, stronger now, laced with something else. The hot, metallic edge of rage. This wasn't a hunter searching for food. This was a predator hunting for vengeance. It stepped into the clearing, and I understood why the legends always talk about one Bigfoot in a given area. This wasn't just another member of the same kind. This was something larger, older, more dangerous. Maybe the leader, maybe the mate of the one we'd killed. It stood at least 9 feet tall, broader, more muscular than the first. Its coat was darker, almost black, and its face was scored with scars from years of fights and survival. But it was the intelligence in its eyes that shook me. It saw what we had done. It understood exactly what had happened, and it had come to make us pay. It looked down at the dead creature, and the sound that came out of it was devastating. A keening wail that spoke of loss and grief and a pain beyond the body. Then it lifted its gaze to us, and I saw the killing intent there. It charged no hesitation, no moment of shock. It came at us like something with nothing left to lose. We opened up immediately, all 4 rifles firing at once. But this one was ready. It zigzagged, used the trees as cover, and turned itself into a nightmare target. Our shots hit, I saw the impacts, the spray of blood, but they didn't slow it down. This thing was bigger, stronger, smarter than the first. It had learned from what happened to its companion, and it wasn't going to make the same mistakes. It closed the distance in seconds, and suddenly we were fighting for our lives. It hit us like a natural disaster. It grabbed the nearest man, the one who fired the first shot, and lifted him as if he weighed nothing. The crack of breaking bones was audible even over our screaming, and the creature's roar. We kept firing, trying to pick our shots so we wouldn't hit our friend, but the creature used him like a shield while it dismantled him, methodical and unstoppable. When it was finished, it tossed the body aside like a rag doll and turned on the rest of us. I have never been so afraid. This wasn't hunting anymore. It wasn't even a fight. This was survival, and we were outmatched. The creature moved with speed and agility that made a mockery of its size, every blow landing with the force of a sledgehammer. One of the others tried to run, maybe got 10 steps before it caught him. I heard the scream cut off, and when I spun around, there was only a pool of blood spread across the pine needles. Only 2 of us were left, and in my friend's eyes, I saw the same panic pounding inside my own chest. We were going to die out here, torn apart by something that had every right to hate us for what we'd done. The creature seemed to know we were beaten. It stopped charging and began circling us instead. wounded but still strong, cutting off our escape. It was toying with us, now drawing out its revenge for the companion we had killed. When it finally came for us, my friend tried to make a stand. He grabbed a heavy branch and swung it like a club, desperate to buy us time or space. The thing caught it in one massive hand and snapped it like a toothpick, then did to him what it had done to the others. And just like that, I was alone. Alone, facing something out of a nightmare. And I knew I had only seconds before it finished me too. Something inside me broke then. Not courage, not heroism, just pure animal panic. All rational thought vanished. Instinct took over. I dropped my rifle and ran. I tore through the forest like a man possessed. Branches ripped my clothes and skin. Roots clawed at my feet, trying to trip me. Behind me, I could hear it giving chase, but it wasn't rushing. Maybe it knew I couldn't escape. Maybe it wanted to savor the hunt. I ran uphill, downhill, through streams, over fallen logs, through brush so thick I had to throw myself through it. My lungs burned, my legs cramped, but I couldn't stop. Every time I faltered, I heard those massive footsteps closing in. At some point, I realized I didn't hear them anymore. I stopped, gasping for breath, straining to listen. Nothing. The forest was silent again. Either it had given up, or it was stalking me in silence. I moved on carefully, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that blood-soaked clearing. I had no idea where I was going, no landmarks, no trail, no plan, just the desperate need to get away. Hours passed, the sun shifted across the sky. That's when it hit me. I was lost. I had run blindly, with no thought for direction. I could be miles from our camp, or circling back on myself. In this rugged wilderness, there was no way to know. By the time darkness fell, I collapsed beside a small creek. My legs couldn't carry me any farther. Dehydrated, shaking, half delirious, I drank straight from the water and tried to orient myself, but everything looked the same in the fading light. Reality hit me hard then. My friends were dead, ripped apart by something that shouldn't even exist. I was alone in the wild. No supplies, no map, no way to call for help. And somewhere out there, that creature might still be hunting me. I spent the night curled at the base of a tree, jumping at every sound, expecting at any moment to see those glowing eyes in the dark. But nothing came. Either it decided I wasn't worth chasing, or it was content to let the wilderness finish me off. It took me 3 days of wandering before I stumbled across anything resembling civilization. 3 days drinking from creeks, eating berries that may or may not have been poisonous, and catching restless sleep wherever I could find shelter. The first day was the worst. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps behind me, kept glimpsing shapes in the trees that turned out to be shadows or deer. The fear was constant, overwhelming. I could barely function, barely think of anything except escape. By the second day, the raw terror had settled into a state of constant, gnawing vigilance. I was still afraid, but now I was also starving, thirsty, and beginning to realize I might die out here even if the creature never found me. The forest seemed endless, stretching for miles upon miles, every ridge, stream, and grove blending into one another. I tried following water, hoping it would lead somewhere, but the streams only wound deeper into the wilderness. On the third day, I stumbled onto what looked like an old logging road, overgrown, unused for years, but clearly man-made. I followed it for hours. Just when I began to think it would lead nowhere, I saw something that made me cry with relief. A ranger station. Small, weathered, but clearly still in use. A truck parked out front. Smoke curling from the chimney. When the ranger answered my frantic pounding, he took one look at me, scratched and bruised, clothes torn to shreds, and immediately started asking questions. Through hell, that's the only way to describe what I'd been through. I told the ranger about the hunting trip, about getting lost, about my friends going missing, but I didn't mention the creatures. I wasn't ready for that conversation, and I knew exactly how insane it would sound. The ranger called in search and rescue and gave me food and water while we waited. The search for my friends lasted 2 weeks. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers from local hiking clubs, even some National Guard units. They swept every square mile of forest around the area where we had gone in. They found our original campsite, tents still standing, most of our gear untouched. They found the game trails we'd followed, including some of the footprints we'd made ourselves. They even found the clearing where it all went down. There was blood, so much of it. Shell casings scattered everywhere, bullet holes ripped into tree trunks, deep gashes clawed into bark. Signs of something violent, something desperate, but no bodies, no friends, no creature. The official report blamed a bear attack. The explanation was neat, tidy. We'd stumbled on a grizzly, panicked, opened fire. In the chaos, my friends were killed and either dragged off or wandered away, wounded, never to be found. It wrapped everything up, except for one problem. There haven't been grizzly bears in that part of the country for over 50 years. Nobody wanted to talk about that inconvenient truth. Any alternative explanation was too crazy to take seriously, so they stuck with the bear story, and that was that. That was 3 years ago, and I've never been the same. I can't set foot in the woods anymore. Hell, I can barely stand being near trees at all. The smell of pine needles, the creak of branches in the wind, it all brings everything flooding back. That stink of wet fur, the intelligence in those eyes, the screams of my friends. I've tried therapy, medication, everything I could think of to deal with the memories. But nothing works because I know what really happened out there. And I know if I ever told the truth, they'd lock me away in a psych ward. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we just left that first creature alone. If we had watched it from a distance, kept the secret to ourselves, and gone home. Those things had lived in that forest for God knows how long, bothering no one, just trying to survive, and we destroyed it. We invaded their territory, killed one of them in cold blood, and the price was my friends' lives. The worst part is the guilt. I ran. When my friends needed me most, when we should have stood together and fought, I abandoned them. I tell myself it wouldn't have made a difference, that we were all doomed anyway. But I know the truth. I was a coward. And lately, I've been having dreams. Dreams that feel more like memories. Dreams of something watching me from the tree line. Times I've woken up to muddy footprints on my porch, far too big to belong to any human. Times I've glimpsed movement in my backyard at night. Last week, I found claw marks on the side of my house. Deep gouges, 8 feet up the wall, just like the ones we saw carved into that tree in the forest. I think it found me. Somehow, it tracked me across hundreds of miles of wilderness. And now, it's just waiting for the right moment to finish what we started. Maybe that's why I'm finally telling this story. Maybe I know I won't get another chance. If something happens to me, if I disappear like my friends did, at least someone out there will know the truth. There are things in those deep woods that we don't understand. Things best left alone. That day, we thought we were the hunters. We were wrong. We were just another kind of prey. And some predators hunt for reasons that have nothing to do with food. I can hear something outside my house right now. Heavy footsteps in the yard, pausing at each window as if looking for a way in. The motion lights keep flicking on and off. But when I look, there's nothing there. Nothing I can see. But I can smell it. That same stench of wet fur and rot drifting from the trees. It's here. And it remembers. The scratching on the walls. I can hear it moving from window to window, testing each one. My dog is cowering under the kitchen table, whining the way he used to during thunderstorms as a puppy. I've been preparing for this moment for months, ever since the dreams began. Stockpiled supplies in the basement, planned escape routes, even packed a med kit in case I had to run. But deep down, I know I can't keep running. It tracked me here across hundreds of miles. It won't stop just because I move again. This ends one way or another, and maybe that's exactly what I deserve. Maybe this is justice for what we did out there. We killed something that was only trying to live peacefully in its own territory. And now, the final consequence has come for me. I keep thinking back to that moment in the clearing, the first time we saw the creature. How calm it looked as it went about its business arranging stones or pieces of wood in patterns that hinted at an alien intelligence. It wasn't hurting anyone. It wasn't threatening us. It was just living its life in the deep woods where humans had no right to tread. And we destroyed it. We brought violence and death into a place that may have known peace for centuries. All because one of us wanted to be famous. Wanted proof. Wanted to show the world that the legends were real. And ironically, we proved it. Bigfoot is real. They live in the remote wilderness where people rarely go. They are intelligent. They have complex social structures. They grieve their dead. And they remember injustice. If I had the chance to do it again, I would have pointed that rifle away. I would have begged my friends to just observe, to take notes, to share the discovery with the world without bloodshed. But I can't change the past. All I can do now is live with the consequences and hope my story convinces someone else not to make the same mistakes. The scratching has stopped. The house is completely silent, the way the forest was before our first encounter. That absolute silence, like the whole world is holding its breath, waiting for something awful to happen. I can see shapes moving past the windows now, too tall, too broad, moving with that same deliberate gait I remember from the clearing. It's circling the house, learning its layout, planning its approach. My phone battery is almost dead. I need to finish this before it's too late. If anyone ever finds this account after I'm gone, please, don't make the same mistakes we did. Don't hunt these creatures out of fear or pride. Don't treat them like trophies. They are people, in their own way, different from us, alien in their minds and their motives, but still people. They have families, communities, emotions. They feel pain, grief, and anger just as we do. We proved they exist, but the price for that knowledge was terrible. My friends died screaming because we couldn't leave well enough alone, because we had to push and pry, and ultimately destroy something ancient and beautiful that should have been left in peace. If you ever see one of these wild beings, count yourself lucky. You are witnessing what almost no human ever will, something that connects us to our own primal past. Observe from a distance, take notes if you must. But don't approach, don't threaten, and whatever you do, don't try to harm it. They remember everything. They have their own sense of justice, and they never forgive. The smartphone was found face down, 6 inches deep in the mud. Its cracked screen reflected the pale morning light filtering through the old-growth canopy of the Olympic Peninsula. When investigators powered it on 3 weeks after Bill Morrison vanished, the device contained 247 photos and videos, the last 23 documented things that should not exist under any known law of nature or science. What follows is the complete record of those final days, pieced together from journal entries, photographic evidence, and audio recordings no human should ever have to hear. On March 12, 2017, 8-year-old wildlife photographer Bill Morrison set out into the remote forests of Washington State's Olympic Peninsula for what should have been another 5-day photography trip. He never came back. 3 weeks later, search teams discovered his abandoned campsite deep in the woods, a scene of devastation no one could explain. Among the wreckage were his smartphone, his camera equipment, and his journal. Together, they documented Morrison's last days, and what they reveal challenges everything we think we know about what exists in America's darkest wilderness. Bill Morrison was no amateur. He had spent more than a decade mastering his craft in some of the most unforgiving wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. His Instagram account, followed by thousands of outdoor enthusiasts, showcased spectacular images from places few people ever dared to venture. Morrison was meticulous, a professional who understood both the technical demands of wilderness photography and the survival skills needed to work alone in remote environments. His gear reflected that expertise. Professional, grade cameras, built for harsh conditions, specialized lenses for low-light forest photography, and backup systems that had carried him safely through countless solo expeditions. He carried an emergency beacon, a water filtration system, and enough supplies to last for weeks if needed. Those who knew his work understood. If anyone could handle whatever the mountains threw at him, it was Bill Morrison. But this final expedition proved that even the best prepared explorers can encounter something far beyond human understanding or control. His catalog of images shows a man drawn to the edges of the natural world, the boundaries where the known dissolves into the unknown, where civilization fades into primal wilderness. His photos captured mist-shrouded valleys where ancient trees loomed like giants from another age, waterfalls plunging into pools that refused to reflect the sky, and trails winding ever deeper into shadow. It was this fascination with the unknown that ultimately drew Bill into the Sasquatch Triangle, an area that had claimed others before him and would add his name to a list of disappearances stretching back more than a century. The Olympic Peninsula has long been a place of dark secrets. Its vast wilderness hides mysteries older than memory itself. The region Morrison chose for his final expedition is infamous even by local standards. Known as the Sasquatch Triangle, It covers more than 40 miles of untouched forest where compasses spin erratically, GPS devices fail without explanation, and even the most experienced guides lose their bearings. Native accounts speak of the Sills, massive fur-covered beings that dwell in the forest's deepest reaches. Not the gentle giants of modern cryptozoology, but something far older, far more complex, and possibly far more dangerous. Tribal stories describe them as possessing intelligence equal to or greater than humans, with their own society, territories, and an ancient hatred for trespassers. Records of strange encounters in this region stretch back to the 1,890 seconds, when the first logging crews reported tools vanishing overnight, giant footprints encircling their camps, and bone-chilling howls that seemed to echo from every direction at once. Loggers claimed to return to their sites and find massive trees felled overnight without saw marks, as if wrenched from the earth by impossible force. More recently, the region has seen an unsettling number of disappearances with disturbing similarities. Experienced hikers vanishing along well-marked trails without leaving the slightest trace, branches snapped somewhere behind. Search teams later found abandoned campsites showing signs of systematic destruction, personal items, arranged into strange, unnatural patterns, and enormous footprints leading deeper into the wilderness, only to stop abruptly, as if their maker had stepped into the trees themselves or melted back into the forest. The land here seemed designed to swallow secrets. The canopy overhead blocked most of the sunlight, creating a twilight world where shadows moved independently of their sources. The normal rules of the forest ecosystem seemed suspended. Ancient lava tubes cut through the landscape, forming an unmapped subterranean network. Some passages were wide enough to drive a truck through, while others snaked for miles in utter darkness before spilling out into valleys absent from any official map. In some areas, the forest was so dense rescue helicopters couldn't break through the canopy. Their rotors snagged on branches that seemed to reach deliberately to block anything trying to intrude from above. Ground teams reported that radios would suddenly fail at certain invisible boundaries, as if the forest itself generated interference to isolate anyone who strayed too deep. It was into this primordial darkness that Bill Morrison disappeared, carrying the cameras that would capture his final days and the forces that took him. His handwritten journal, found wrapped in plastic near his ruined campsite, recorded the expedition with his usual professional precision until something in the woods began recording him. The entries reveal a steady shift from scientific observation to growing unease to uncontrolled horror as he realized he was no longer the observer, but the prey. March 12, Day 1. Perfect conditions for the start of the expedition. Entered the forest at dawn, following a primitive trail deeper than I've ever gone before. The trees here are ancient. Some of these giants stood long before Europeans ever set eyes on the Pacific Northwest. Photographed several rare lichens and what may be evidence of Roosevelt elk activity, though the tracks are unusually large and spaced farther apart than expected. The forest has a cathedral-like beauty, silent and reverent. Light filters down through the canopy in shifting shafts, creating natural spotlights that wander across the forest floor as the day passes. Even the air feels different here. Heavier, richer with oxygen, as though I'm breathing the exhalations of trees that have photosynthesized for centuries. Set up camp near a small, clear-running stream fed by some underground source. The sound of running water is the only noise breaking the stillness. Everything went according to plan, though the isolation is profound. The nearest road is 15 miles away. The trail I followed here is barely visible, more like a deer path than anything maintained by the Forest Service. March 13, Day 2. Pushed deeper today into what feels like truly uncharted country. The game trails seem to lead toward the heart of the forest. GPS signal is patchy under this canopy. It feels completely cut off from the modern world. The satellite imagery I studied before this trip didn't prepare me for the density of this place. From above, it must look like a solid green carpet. From the ground, it's a three-dimensional maze of trunks, branches, and undergrowth. Came across several strange geological formations, caves carved into limestone outcrops, weathered in patterns that look almost intentional, as if shaped by hands rather than erosion. Noted several sites for later investigation if time permits. The quiet here is unsettling far more than any wilderness I've ever worked in. In all my years photographing wildlife, I've never experienced silence like this. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seems stilled by the canopy overhead. It's beautiful, but deeply disturbing, as though the forest itself is holding its breath, waiting. I set camp in a clearing surrounded by massive Douglas firs, some easily over 4 centuries old. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, the rush of blood in my ears. There is something almost prehistoric about this place, as if I had stepped backward in time to an earth still young, ruled by laws foreign to our modern understanding of nature. March 14, Day 3. Something is wrong here. Last night, I heard sounds unlike any animal I know. Deep, resonant calls echoing across the forest from multiple directions. They seemed conversational, as though several immense creatures were communicating across distance. One call would begin in one direction, answered from another, then again from a third, forming a triangle of voices that surrounded my camp. The sounds are nearly impossible to describe. Too deep and powerful for a human throat, too structured and purposeful for random animal noise. There was something almost linguistic in the patterns, rises and falls in pitch, suggesting emphasis, meaning even emotion. Whatever made those calls was intelligent, and it knew I was here. This morning I found tracks near the stream that shook me more than I expected. Enormous, clearly defined impressions shaped like bare feet, but impossibly large. Each measured nearly 18 inches long, 7 inches across, pressed deep into the mud with a weight I can't begin to imagine. The stride between them was close to 6 feet. Whatever left those prints was far taller than any human. At first I thought they might be an elaborate hoax left by hikers, but the longer I studied them, the less I believed that. The depth and detail matched the weight distribution of a living creature. The toe impressions showed anatomy too precise to fake, and the trail extended for hundreds of yards in both directions along the stream, far beyond what any prankster could stage. I photographed everything carefully, though a part of me knew I should have packed up and returned to civilization immediately. But the pull of discovery went far beyond professional curiosity. What if I was on the verge of documenting something mainstream science had never acknowledged? What if these forests truly shelter a species unknown to man? March 15, Day 4. Against every survival instinct, I followed the tracks deeper today. They led me to discoveries that challenge everything I thought I knew about the wildlife and geography of the Pacific Northwest. The prints converged at what can only be described as forest structures, not made by human hands, but unmistakably built with intelligence and intent. Trees bent and woven together formed shapes that looked like shelters, territorial markers, or even communication devices. Some of these bent trunks were Douglas firs, more than 6 inches thick at the point of manipulation. The force required to bend them without snapping would be extraordinary, far beyond human capability, without heavy machinery. Yet there were no tool marks, no ropes, no levers, just raw, unimaginable strength applied with uncanny precision. The construction methods bore no resemblance to human architecture or engineering. Instead of cutting or binding, the builders seemed to shape living trees while they still grew, creating organic structures that blended seamlessly into the forest. Some bent trees showed signs of having grown in their altered positions for years, the bark healing around the curves, the branches continuing to grow in the imposed direction. The trail ended at a cluster of caves, carved into limestone outcrops, rising from the forest floor like ancient monuments. The caves themselves looked natural, but their entrances had been modified, expanded, and shaped to accommodate creatures far larger than humans. Inside one chamber, I found something that defied easy explanation: murals covering nearly every surface of the inner rooms, depicting what appeared to be interactions between humans and large, bipedal, fur-covered beings. The artwork spanned centuries, showing different styles and skill levels that suggested multiple generations of artists had worked in the same place. Some images looked ancient, painted in earth tones with techniques that predated the well-known artistic traditions of the Pacific Northwest. Others looked more recent, incorporating details that hinted at contact with modern humans. The theme was consistent: tall, powerful creatures with human-like intelligence, but clearly not human anatomy. Some panels showed peaceful interaction, creatures and people sharing food, building structures together, even gathering for ritual or ceremonial events. Other images were far darker chase scenes, captures, and what might be ritual behaviors involving leading humanoid figures into cave systems. I documented everything in photos and video, though I began to feel less like an observer and more like the observed. I found fresh prints around my campsite this morning. They circled my tent while I slept, studying me the way I had been studying the evidence they left behind. The realization that I was being watched was as thrilling as it was terrifying. March 16, Day 5, final entry. They know I'm here and they've decided to make contact. Last night marked a turning point in whatever relationship had developed between us over the past days. Around midnight, something massive began moving through the forest around my camp. I could hear branches snapping under enormous weight, heavy footfalls that seemed to shake the ground beneath my shelter. These sounds weren't random or frantic like an animal startled into flight. The movements were deliberate, purposeful, calculated. Whatever was out there was slowly pacing my camp in a pattern that suggested reconnaissance or assessment. For more than 3 hours, those heavy steps circled me, always just out of reach of my flashlight. The calls started around 2 a.m., that same deep, resonant cry I'd heard before, but now much closer and clearly directed at me. The sounds seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, implying several large individuals coordinating their movements. There was an unmistakable conversational quality to the exchanges, as if they were discussing me debating what to do with this trespasser on their territory. At about 4 a.m., the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. I lay in the tent, barely daring to breathe, aware of a vast presence looming right outside my shelter. I could hear deep, powerful breathing that seemed to come from directly above my tent, as if something tall enough to cast a shadow over the whole campsite was bending down to peer in. At dawn, I discovered my gear had been disturbed during the night. Nothing was taken or damaged. Everything had been inspected with what can only be described as scientific curiosity. My pack had been moved and carefully opened. Food containers had been taken out, examined with a precision that suggested intention, and then placed back exactly where they belonged. My camera equipment had been nudged, but not harmed. Even my journal had been opened to the current page, then closed and returned to its original spot. This is not the random behavior of hungry or territorial animals. There is intelligence behind every action, curiosity, and purpose that suggest cognitive abilities equal to or surpassing human intelligence. They studied me as I studied them, but with advantages I cannot hope to match. I should pack up and leave immediately. Every rational part of me is shouting to get out of this forest while I still can. But I'm so close to documenting something extraordinary that I can't pull back. This could be a discovery that changes everything we think we know about who shares our planet. I've set up cameras all around the expanded campsite, including night vision rigs and motion sensors. If these creatures approach again, I'll have scientific evidence the community cannot ignore. The batteries should last at least 48 hours. The sun is setting, and I hear them calling to one another in the distance. Tonight, there are more voices than before, more than last night, many more. It sounded like they were gathering, converging on this place from across the forest. I don't know what they were planning, but I intended to document every second of whatever happened next. If someone finds this journal, know that I went into whatever followed willingly. The fear was overwhelming, yes, but so was the excitement of being present for something that might never happen again in human history. I'd spent my entire adult life documenting the natural world, but tonight, I might witness something that went beyond the natural order as we understand it. They were getting closer now. I could see shapes moving between the trees, forms blending with the darkness until they chose to reveal themselves. In just minutes, I would either record the most significant wildlife evidence ever captured, or these would be the final words I'd ever write. The largest of them now stood at the edge of my camp, just beyond the firelight. Its eyes reflected the flames like polished brass, and in them was an intelligence that felt both alien and familiar. It was waiting for a signal, a decision, a moment when fear and awe balanced on the edge of communication. I'm going to approach it. God help me. I'm going to try to make contact. The journal entries end there, the ink trailing off mid-sentence as if Bill's hand had been interrupted. But his cameras kept recording, capturing what unfolded after he set his pen down. The recovered images from Bill's network of equipment pieced together a chilling chronological portrait of his final days, each frame more unsettling than the last. His professional gear kept running long after he vanished, motion sensors triggering photos and videos of events no human eye witnessed. The first images were exactly what you'd expect from Bill Morrison's acclaimed portfolio: hauntingly beautiful shots of the Olympic Peninsula wilderness, sunbeams filtering through towering old growth, trees disappearing into mist high above, fragile ferns reaching out across a forest floor locked in perpetual twilight. These photographs displayed the same technical mastery and artistic vision that had earned Bill recognition in the outdoor photography community. But even in these seemingly ordinary shots, careful review revealed subtle irregularities, shadows at the frame's edge, shapes that could have been trees or tricks of light, but that showed vertical symmetry and consistent proportions hinting at something else entirely. The first clear anomaly appeared in what looked like an ordinary forest scene: towering Douglas firs, sunlight filtering through, a carpet of ancient ferns fading into the haze. But hidden halfway into the frame was a dark, upright figure, partially obscured by brush. It stood perfectly still among the trees, its posture suggesting it had been observing Bill long before he noticed and raised his camera. Its placement was deliberate, close enough to be captured, but distant enough for its details to remain maddeningly indistinct. Balanced effortlessly on a steep slope that would challenge any human, the figure radiated both immense strength and an intimate familiarity with the unforgiving terrain. Later photos showed the watchers becoming bolder as the days went on. One image captured two massive dark shapes striding upright along what looked like a vertical game trail, their gait strange, almost too loose, distinctly inhuman. Their proportions were deeply unsettling: too tall, shoulders and chests impossibly broad, arms swinging down to nearly knee level. They moved through dense brush with ease, as if these trails had been theirs for generations. The image quality was stunning. Even under difficult light, Bill's professional equipment caught enough detail to confirm these were not human. Their hair looked coarse and thick, covering nearly every visible part of their bodies except the palms of their hands and the barest glimpse of their faces. Their posture, though upright, carried something primitive, an echo of the ancient, looking back at us through the lens. A single forward lean revealed immense power in the shoulders and arms, yet the fluid grace of its movements spoke of perfect adaptation to its forest domain. As the photographic sequence continued, the creatures seemed less concerned with concealment and more focused on actively observing their human visitor. One image captured a massive figure standing at the edge of Bill's campsite, its sheer size dwarfing the vegetation around it. The creature's face was partially obscured, visible only in profile, revealing features that blended human and primitive traits in deeply unsettling ways. The heavy brow ridge and pronounced jawline suggested overwhelming physical strength, but the position of the eyes and the shape of the skull, as seen in silhouette, betrayed an intelligence that was aware, calculating, and deliberate. This being wasn't simply glancing at Bill's camp. It was studying it, evaluating the equipment, the layout, the threats, and the opportunities introduced by a human presence in its territory. But it was the final sequence of images that provided the clearest and most disturbing documentation of Bill Morrison's encounter with whatever inhabits the deepest reaches of the Olympic wilderness. The photos revealed what appeared to be a complex social group. Multiple creatures of differing sizes and ages gathered around the perimeter of Bill's expanded campsite. The largest loomed nearly 10 feet tall, its massive body covered in dark, coarse hair that seemed to absorb, rather than reflect, the dim ambient light. Its proportions suggested astonishing physical power: shoulders that would dwarf even the strongest of human athletes, arms that reached further than any humans could, and a barrel chest built for immense endurance. Smaller figures clustered nearby, displaying the same anatomical traits, but with proportions that hinted at youth or sexual dimorphism within the species. Some stood nearly as tall as the giant, though with more slender builds. Others were clearly younger, sharing the same fundamental body structure but only 2/3 the size of the adults. Most striking of all was the evidence of social structure and communication visible in the images. These beings were not merely gathering at random. They maintained specific spatial relationships that suggested hierarchy, distinction, and coordinated behavior. The largest individual always positioned itself between the smaller figures and Bill's camp, clearly both leader and protector. Some photos even captured moments of obvious communication, postures, gestures, and stances that indicated a system of social signaling normally associated with higher intelligence. These weren't simple animals acting on instinct. They were thinking beings capable of planning, discussion, and coordinated action. What was most unsettling, however, was their apparent familiarity with human behavior and technology. Rather than displaying fear or confusion at Bill's cameras and equipment, they showed curiosity and what seemed like understanding. One photo showed the largest creature reaching toward one of Bill's motion-activated cameras, its massive hand in full view as it leaned closer, an expression of clear awareness of the device's function and purpose. That hand alone was a study in evolutionary impossibility, clearly derived from the same basic blueprint as a human's, yet vastly expanded and modified for crushing grip strength. The fingers were proportionally longer, with musculature and joints far more robust. The palm bore the calluses and development that could only come from a lifetime of grasping trees and stone surfaces with enough force to shatter human bone. Several images documented the creature's astonishing adaptations to their forest environment. They were shown moving through dense undergrowth with perfect silence, their bodies gliding past obstacles like water around stone. Others captured them climbing massive trees with startling agility, ascending the trunks of giants, as if they were nothing more than stairways carved into the wild. There was no visible effort in their movements. They slipped through the canopy with a fluidity that made them seem as comfortable 30 feet above the forest floor as they would have been on the ground. One particularly sharp image showed a mid-sized creature, possibly a female or younger adult, suspended horizontally from a thick branch high above Bill's campsite, perhaps 30 feet in the air. It was clearly observing the human activity below with an intelligence that could not be denied. Its position had been deliberately chosen, granting it a perfect vantage point while keeping its body concealed from ground level. The strength required to hold such a posture for any length of time would have been extraordinary, yet the creature appeared completely at ease, as though it were doing nothing more demanding than leaning against a wall. The final photos in the sequence, captured by Bill's handheld camera, offered an entirely different perspective. Shot from low angles, the frames revealed that Bill was no longer standing upright when he took them. They chronicled the final approach of the beings, their massive forms looming directly overhead, lit by the pale glow of dawn filtering through the forest canopy. The last clear image showed the face of the largest creature in astonishing detail, taken from no more than 6 feet away. The features were unmistakably intelligent. Deep-set eyes held a consciousness that was both alien and achingly familiar. A broad nose suggested an ability to process complex scents within the deep forest, while the mouth hinted at both immense bite force and the capacity to produce intricate vocalizations. But it was the expression in those eyes that lingered an intelligence at once foreign and intimate, ancient yet close at hand. There was no malice in that gaze, yet no question about the outcome of this encounter. The creature looked at Bill with what could only be described as regret, as if it understood his fear but also knew events had moved past the point of retreat. The last image stored in the camera's memory was blurred, overexposed, and yet unmistakable, a massive hand reaching toward the lens. Moments later, the memory card was full, ending the photographic record of Bill Morrison's encounter with the unknown inhabitants of the Olympic wilderness. Investigators used the embedded GPS data in Bill's images to pinpoint the limestone caves he described in his journal. What they found inside defied imagination, a gallery of artwork spanning centuries, documenting an ongoing relationship between human beings and non-human intelligence in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. The cave system extended far beyond what Bill had initially explored. Some passages forced investigators to crawl, while others opened into cathedral-like spaces. The limestone walls, shaped by millennia of water, provided smooth, natural canvases that had been used again and again across the ages. Paintings covered nearly every available surface across multiple chambers. They depicted what could only be described as a complex, evolving relationship between humans and towering, fur-covered bipedal beings. The artistic styles varied dramatically, suggesting work created over vast stretches of time by artists of different skill levels and cultural backgrounds. The oldest paintings, found in the deepest chambers, displayed the most primitive artistic techniques, yet also the most anatomically precise depictions of the creatures themselves. These ancient images had been rendered in earthy pigments drawn from local minerals and plants, applied with techniques that revealed a sophisticated understanding of how to create art that could endure for centuries on limestone walls. The earliest paintings focused almost entirely on the beings themselves, depicting them in activities that revealed their social structures and relationship to the forest. Family groups were shown foraging, caring for young, and building the bent tree structures Bill had seen in the wilderness. The anatomical precision suggested artists who had observed their subjects closely over long periods of time, capturing everything from muscle definition to subtle facial expressions. One chamber contained what appeared to be a catalog of the creature's social hierarchy. Figures were posed in ways that unmistakably indicated rank and role within their communities. The largest individuals were consistently positioned as protectors or leaders, while smaller figures were depicted in specialized activities. Some gathered food, others constructed and maintained forest structures, while still others acted as scouts or sentinels. Most striking were the depictions of intelligence and problem-solving. Some paintings illustrated tool use far beyond sticks and stones. There were carefully crafted implements, clearly designed for specific purposes. One scene showed a creature using a lever-like system to shift massive boulders, while another revealed the construction of elaborate shelters requiring a sophisticated understanding of structural engineering. In the middle layers of artwork came the first depictions of direct interaction between humans and the creatures. These showed a spectrum of contact ranging from cautious observation to active cooperation. Some murals portrayed humans and the beings working side by side on construction projects, sharing food, and even engaging in what appeared to be ritual or trade exchanges. In a few scenes, the larger beings seemed to be instructing humans, teaching them survival techniques, demonstrating how to find food, build shelter, and navigate the wilderness. The humans in these depictions were clearly not modern, but appeared to represent indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, their tools and clothing consistent with pre-contact cultures. But not all interactions were benign. Other chambers contained darker imagery scenes of conflict and predation. Humans were painted fleeing from towering pursuers or being dragged deeper into the forest. These panels pulsed with emotional intensity, as though the artists had either witnessed or endured such events. The most disturbing murals appeared in a chamber reserved for ritual imagery. Here, humans were shown in states of fear and distress, surrounded by groups of the creatures arranged in what appeared to be ceremonial formations. The exact meaning of these depictions remains unclear, but they suggested that the relationship between humans and the beings was far more complex and potentially dangerous than the cooperative scenes might imply. The most recent additions to this subterranean gallery offered undeniable evidence of modern contact. These newer paintings had been made with commercial pigments and materials and depicted unmistakable modern details. Backpacks, cameras, GPS devices, even contemporary camping gear. The style of the artwork had also shifted, showing influences from European traditions, suggesting that the unknown artists had at some point been exposed to modern artistic techniques. Yet the focus remained unchanged: documentation. Just as the oldest images recorded family groups and hunting practices, the newest murals depicted hikers, photographers, and campers watched from the shadows by massive, fur-covered figures. The level of detail in these modern portrayals was chillingly precise. The faces of humans were captured with accuracy, down to the reflective lenses of their glasses or the stitching on their jackets, details too fine to be invented from imagination alone. The level of detail in these modern paintings was remarkable, showing that the artists did not just observe these objects, they understood their functions. Most chilling of all were the contemporary murals that seemed to record the fates of many people who had gone missing over recent decades. Frame after frame depicted humans being led away from their campsites, guided or carried by the creatures, deeper into a cave system that extended far beyond the decorated chambers. In every case, the human figures display fear and confusion, while the creatures appear calm and purposeful. One recent panel appears to show Bill himself recognizable from his camera gear and the distinctive design of his backpack. The painting captures him on the edge of his camp as massive shadows close in from the surrounding trees, rendering the last moments of the human agent with striking accuracy. surprise mixed with dawning terror as he realizes the magnitude of what he's encountering. The final room contained the most recent works images apparently made days or weeks after Bill disappeared. They portray the same scene from multiple viewpoints, a human being escorted by the creatures through underground passages with evident familiarity and ease. Most disturbing of all is the sequential series of paintings that show the same human figure changing. In the first image, he is terrified and struggling. In a later one, he appears calm, standing unsupported in the middle of a group of creatures. His posture suggests acceptance rather than captivity, as if whatever process began in fear and resistance had reached some form of resolution. The implications are horrifying and irreducible. Either these murals document a form of adaptation or conditioning that allows humans to exist among the creatures, or they record something worse, an erasure of identity, the reduction of missing people into something less than who they once were. The investigation into Bill Morrison's disappearance became one of the largest wilderness searches in Olympic Peninsula history and yielded more questions than answers. In the 6 months after his campsite was found, teams scoured hundreds of square miles of dense forest using tracking dogs, helicopter surveys, and skilled ground rescue teams. The search patterns revealed disturbing consistencies that extended well beyond Bill's single case. Within a 20-mile radius of his last known camp, investigators located evidence of at least 7 other abandoned campsites dating from within the past 15 years. Each site shared common features: systematically destroyed equipment, personal items arranged into unnatural patterns, and massive footprints leading into the heart of the woods. Tracking dogs brought to follow Bill's scent displayed behavior their handlers hadn't seen in decades. While the dogs would follow a normal human scent trail up to the edge of Bill's camp, they then refused to continue. Some became extremely agitated as they faced the trails leading out of the camp, whining and backing away as if sensing a predator the handlers could not detect. Most experienced trackers ultimately refused to follow the creature's trail beyond a certain point. Those giant prints led through terrain that became increasingly impossible for humans. Sheer cliffs requiring climbing gear, bramble so dense it would shred clothing and flesh, and into cave systems that plunged deep underground with no clear exit. Equipped teams tried to follow some of these subterranean routes, but found the cave networks extended far beyond what their gear or training could safely manage. Emergency radios failed to hold contact once teams advanced a few hundred feet into the tunnels, and some searchers reported an overwhelming sensation of being watched by invisible observers in the dark. As evidence accumulated, the inquiry took on a surreal quality that defied rational explanation. Trail cameras placed around the search area captured images of the creatures dozens of times, but the animals seemed aware of the cameras and would approach to inspect them before continuing on. In some cases, the cameras were found repositioned to face different directions, as if the creatures were deliberately redirecting surveillance equipment. Ground teams also discovered tree structures identical to those Bill had described, bent and woven living trunks shaped with the same precision, integrated into the forest like native architecture. The shelters were documented and logged with GPS coordinates, yet investigators found that these structures appeared and vanished with disturbing frequency. Shelters photographed one day would be gone the next, while new ones would rise in entirely different locations overnight. The implications were deeply unsettling. Either the creatures were actively managing their territorial markers in direct response to human search efforts, or they possessed the ability to build and dismantle massive wooden frameworks at unbelievable speed. As the search progressed, the evidence of intelligence grew harder to dismiss. Search teams began finding their own equipment had been moved or examined overnight. Nothing was stolen or broken, but personal items were discovered arranged in deliberate patterns, suggesting the entities were studying human technology and behavior. Most troubling of all were the signs that the creatures were actively tracking and possibly manipulating the search itself. Teams would arrive at predetermined coordinates, only to find clues erased or hidden, while fresh evidence would emerge in areas already combed the previous day. The pattern suggested the beings responsible for Bill's disappearance were fully aware of human search protocols and were systematically staying one step ahead. Some searchers reported encounters they were reluctant to describe in official logs. These included fleeting glimpses of massive, fur-covered figures watching from distant ridge lines or tree lines. The beings never approached closely enough for detailed observation, but their presence was unmistakable to those who saw them. What made these sightings especially disturbing was the deliberate strategy behind their behavior. The creatures positioned themselves where they could observe human activity while maintaining safety, demonstrating tactical awareness that implied a sophisticated understanding of human limitations. After 6 months, the official search was suspended. It had become clear that conventional search and rescue methods were inadequate against the terrain and the circumstances. The final report listed Bill Morrison as missing under unexplained circumstances, though investigators privately admitted the evidence pointed toward the involvement of some kind of animal, an animal unlike any previously documented in the natural record. Unofficially, the search had uncovered evidence of a hidden ecosystem operating in parallel with the known wildlife of the Olympic Peninsula. The enormous footprints scattered throughout the region suggested a breeding population of unknown primates that had somehow evaded mainstream biology. Their sophisticated use of tools and construction techniques pointed to a level of intelligence that challenged humanity's assumptions about its uniqueness in the natural world. Most unsettling of all was the accumulated evidence indicating that these beings had been interacting with humans far longer than anyone realized. A review of historical disappearances in the area revealed patterns stretching back more than a century: loggers, hunters, and seasoned hikers vanishing without a trace in the very regions where the most intense signs of the creatures were found. Local indigenous communities, when approached with respect, acknowledged knowledge of these forest dwellers, but were unwilling to discuss details with outside investigators. Their oral traditions spoke of protocols for safe interaction with the people of the woods, protocols regarded as sacred knowledge not to be shared with those lacking cultural context or proper preparation. The investigation also uncovered evidence that the government had long been aware of these beings. Heavily redacted documents obtained through persistent research indicated that multiple federal agencies had quietly investigated anomalous wildlife reports in the Olympic Peninsula. The details of their findings remain classified, but the pattern of official silence suggested that knowledge of the creatures exists at higher levels of government, knowledge actively suppressed to prevent public panic or ecological disruption. Private investigators hired by Bill's family continued searching long after official efforts ceased, but they too encountered the same impossible circumstances that had stymied the original teams. The creatures seemed capable of moving within the forest ecosystem without leaving consistent signs to track. They not only possessed physical abilities far beyond human norms, but also intelligence sufficient to understand and counter human search methods. The final investigation raised far more questions than answers about what truly exists in the deepest reaches of the Olympic Peninsula wilderness. Bill Morrison ventured into a place where different rules seem to apply, where intelligence exists in forms mainstream science refuses to acknowledge, and where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural dissolves into meaninglessness. His disappearance stands as a stark reminder that vast regions of North America remain fundamentally unexplored, not because they are geographically unreachable, but because they are actively guarded by intelligences that predate humanity's arrival on this continent. The forest claimed another victim, but Bill's documentation ensures that his fate will not be forgotten, and that others will be warned of the dangers that lie in venturing too far into places where mankind is neither welcomed nor dominant. For more chilling stories, continue watching here.